Shri Abhishek Singhvi.
Mr. Chairman, sir, I rise on a debate which, sir, is an unusual amalgam of politics, of economics, of technical jargon, of statistical analysis, and indeed of law. It is a debate, sir, which has been oozing out of our respective ears for some many months, and perhaps this delayed debate would have dampened some interest in it. But the issues are no less important. The issues retain their vital importance. And we hope that, especially since the parliamentary debate, there will be far less of explosion or implosion and far more of fusion and fission, or at least far more of light than heat. Sir, this is a matter where if we only keep out of our mind some premeditated notions and approach the subject with a critical inquiring eye and an open mind, and then allow the power of reason and logic to operate. Sir, may I say at the outset that this is a good deal for a good and responsible nation by a good government headed by a good Prime Minister. It is a key which unlocks the door not only to a large hall, but indeed to the universe. It turns us from and outcasts to mainstream players. And sir, we have to judge it not by what we may imagine or dream about. We have to judge it not by somebody's fanciful imagination, but by against what we can get, what we have got. Sir, we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And I shall endeavor, sir, to deal with each of the issues, important, less important, boring, more sensational, as made by the honorable previous speakers, whom I have heard with rapt attention. So let me start, Mr. Chairman, sir, with the issue of energy security, made by my friend Mr. Yechuri. So the basic point on energy security is that there is no one source of energy on which we can give more focus or more importance. The approach has to be multi-pronged, multifaceted, holistic. And that is the complete error, that is the fundamental error of the arguments which have gone by earlier regarding energy security. Sir, as somebody said, statistics can be misleading, like certain articles of clothing. What they conceal is interesting, what they reveal is interesting, what they conceal is vital. But sir, statistics can be instructive. Let us start with the per capita energy consumption of this country. India, and we measure this in a special measure called KGOE, kilograms of oil equivalent. India is roughly 515. Sir, that is 16 times less than the US. It is 9 times less than Japan. It is 8 times less than UK. And it is less than many, many other countries of the world. And of course, of the countries which have nuclear power, we rank almost in the last 2 or 3 globally. Now, the argument made is that at the end of the day, if we have nuclear power, we'll have only 7%. 6% is what Mr. Yechuri says, the correct figure is 7%. He forgets that even 7% would be roughly, and this is only by 2020, would be roughly over 30,000 megawatts, which is an 8-fold increase. It would still be a small percentage, because by then our other sources of energy would also be growing. When other sources grow, the nuclear component percentage will remain small. But that is no reason not to approach it. Let me give you a startling statistic. All of our last 2 or 3 5-year plans, the capacity addition of electricity has been half of what we have projected. We have the figures for the earlier plans, and each plan, the actual capacity added by us is half of what we have projected. Now, sir, if we will have 30,000 MW by 2020 through this deal, if you extrapolate the total amount of energy by 2050 or 2045, the Planning Commission estimates it to be about 1.3 million MW. there is no reason why by 2050, out of the total of 1.3 MW, we should not have 10, 15, 20% by nuclear sources. And what would be 20% of that? 20% of that would be the very impressive figure of 2.6 lakh megawatts from nuclear energy. Today's figure is something like 3,000. Therefore, the fact that you have energy from other sources and that you should pursue energy from other sources cannot ever mean a lackadaisical approach on energy regarding nuclear sources. Why is it that countries like France, of course it's a very high percentage, but countries like Belgium, Sweden, Switzerland, Japan, the lowest figures are 20% for USA and UK, 20% being the figure of the total energy met from nuclear sources. These countries are not foolish. These countries are not suicidal. Belgium has 60%, Sweden has 42%, Switzerland is 39%. But the minimum figure, the lower figures for US and UK are still 20%. So if we aspire to jumpstart our figures to 6 or 7%, what is wrong in that? My friend Mr. Yechury mentioned other sources. Well, sir, the actual procurement from all other sources, if you take the published studies, by 2031, according to the Ministry of Power, we will require 1 million megawatts. According to Planning Commission, we will require 7,78,000 megawatts. Let us take the lower figure of the Planning Commission, 7,78,000. Out of 7,78,000, yes, the total published projected by coal would be 1,70,000. By by imported coal would be another 80,000. By gas, including all forms of gas, 90,000. And adding everything, including hydro, including the unutilized Nepal portion, would be total of less than 3.5 lakh megawatts. These are figures, and we may get lost in figures, but what is the point I'm making? The point is twofold. Even by the Planning Commission estimate of 2031, our total sources of all supplies put together will give us half of our requirement, the total being 7,78,000, the total available being 3,40,000 or 3.5 lakhs. Well, if we can add to it a nuclear source, why should we look a gift horse in the mouth? This 7% is not a static figure. The 7% we believe will increase to 15% by 2050. And by 2050, if you have 15%, it is 15% of over 1.2 million megawatts, which is over 1.5 lakh or 2 lakh megawatts. That is the power of nuclear power. And before I leave the issue of energy security, let me tell you a figure published just 2 days ago. 2 days ago by the World Energy Outlook of 2007, which has recorded that from 2005 to 2030, the maximum increase in energy demand will be in two countries, China and India. And 45% of the total 55% increase in demand in this 25 years will be from India alone. Well, India will be like that because India has a great expectation of GDP growth. And our growth engine is bound to be powered only by that demand and need for power. And if 45% of the global demand increase, energy increase, from 2005 to 2030, 45 out of a total increase of 55 will be from India alone. What are we doing in India? Are we twiddling our thumbs while China is going rampaging in increasing a huge amount of energy, nuclear energy sources? So let me turn to cost. Yes, it's good we look at cost. It's important to look at cost. But sir, just to digress for a moment, the price of oil, crude oil, in 1973 was roughly $2 per barrel. Last month, it was $75 per barrel. Well, do my friends ever talk of the price of oil? Do they talk of the cost of oil? Let me come to that. I have not reached that yet. Have patience. I am only starting with the price of oil, which you, my friends, have been using in this country for the last 30 years at an unaffordable cost. It increases every day. You have no control over it. It is a hugely imported item. You have hardly any indigenous sources, but oil is a mainstay of our consumption. Now let us look at the cost. We'll come to nuclear in a moment. No doubt a coal plant, which incidentally has a life of only 25 to 30 years, and let me tell you, a nuclear plant has a 40 to 50-year life cycle, but no doubt a coal plant is cheaper as far as the initial capital cost is concerned. But 2 points here. Coal is a very transport-intensive product. By the time it reaches you at what is called the load center, where you and I can use it, the cost of coal, that is the relevant cost of coal, which comes to around 3 rupees per unit. Secondly, coal is highly polluting. You do not add the costs of pollution, you do not add the cost of transport. As against that, nuclear, first of all, nuclear is not 11 crores, the figure given by the previous speakers. If you buy nuclear plants from other parts of the world than USA, it can be significantly cheaper, in the region of 8 to 9 crores. But more important than that, the only statistical study published about nuclear plant costs is a study published by Mr. Grover of the DAE. And it's a statistical study of 19 countries which has published and proved that nuclear plants are cheapest if you even count a 20-year cycle. And remember, the cycle of a nuclear plant is 50 years, the cycle of a coal plant is 20 to 30 years. And let me just give you the 4 conclusions of the study by Dr. Grover, published. The report gives ratios on a study in which 19 countries participated. And if you take a lower discount rate of only 5%, nuclear power, I'm reading from the report, is cheaper as compared to gas in all the 19 countries. Secondly, if you take coal, except for South Korea and USA, nuclear power is cheaper in all the 19 countries. Again, if you take 10% discounting, then it is cheaper in more than 15 of the 19 countries. Again, let's not get bogged down in details. The point is, it's a myth to call a nuclear plant more expensive. Yes, a nuclear plant appears to be more expensive because the initial upfront capital cost is higher. The amortized cost over the cycle of a nuclear plant, which is 50 years, is not cheaper. It is significantly cheaper than coal, even if you do not take the pollution costs of coal. It is significantly cheaper than oil, which we import and over which we have no control. It is significantly cheaper than gas, in whose case, in any case, we use mostly oil. And Mr. Chairman, sir, let me add, do we know that 1 gigawatt, that is 1000 megawatts, needs only 1 ton of uranium? Uranium, what is known as U-235, for producing 1 gigawatt of electricity, 1000 MW, you need 1 ton of uranium. The equivalent coal you need to fire to produce that amount of energy is 3 million tons of black coal. That's the equation. That's the equation. So it's again both the arguments of ignoring energy security, because when you talk of nuclear, somebody will point to hydro, somebody will point to coal, somebody will point to gas. That's a fallacy. You have to move ahead on all fronts. And the 7% argument is the initial argument till 2020. The 7% argument is wrong, because in 2040 and 2050, our percentage of 10 or 15% of energy, of nuclear energy, will be a very large absolute figure. Equally, the cost argument is fallacious. It looks at the initial capital cost alone. Let me, sir, with your permission, now turn to a very important part of the argument, the Hyde Act. The Hyde Act has become a kind of a hydra-headed monster as far as those who oppose the bill is concerned. And I can understand that, because those unfamiliar with US constitutional law will find that the Hyde Act is very peculiar. It in fact hides more from them than it reveals. And let me explain why. But the story has to start a little before. The story has to start with the fundamental difference between the Indian constitution and what you and I are used to, or the British parliamentary model, which you and I are used to, and the American constitutional model. And the story therefore starts on the separation of power principle, which is enshrined in the US Constitution, and in particular in Article 6 of that Constitution. And the point I'm making is that under the US Constitution, and I'll just read to you their own Constitution, their own Supreme Law, and the judgments of their own Supreme Court. under that law, namely the US Constitution and the US Supreme Court, the 1, 2, 3 is the supreme law of the land even under US law. In the first place, no conflict will be imagined between the 1, 2, 3 and the Hyde. In the event that there is an irreconcilable conflict, the 1, 2, 3 will prevail. That's the law of the Constitution of the US, that's the law of the US Supreme Court, and let me read that to you. And that's why I can understand that this is why the Hyde Act has this mesmeric influence. First, Article 6 of the US Constitution, it's a long article, the relevant part I am reading. I quote, "The Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made," and the 1, 2, 3 will be a treaty when it is made, "and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the US shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution itself or the laws of that country notwithstanding." In other words, unlike our country, where a treaty will give way even to a parliamentary statute, unlike in our country, a treaty by India with another country will give way to the Indian Constitution. In the US scheme of things, a treaty once entered under their Constitution will not be overridden even by the US Constitution. The last 4 words are, anything in the Constitution or the laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. So that's point 1. The treaty 1, 2, 3 will become the supreme law of the USA. Point number 2, if you still don't believe me and you don't believe the declarations by the US President, let us read the US Supreme Court law. It's all very easy to express incredulity, but unless you've read the US Constitution and the judgments, you can keep on expressing incredulity. That's wrong. Now let me read to you the US Supreme Court judgment, which clearly says the same thing. And there are many judgments. Let me. Well, I am reading to you the US Constitution and the US Supreme Court law. It's very easy, Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad, to debunk it. The difference between debunking something and reading the law is obvious from your statement. You obviously haven't read the law. But for your benefit, let me read the law. Now, let me read to you the law.
Please, you listen to.
Now I am reading to you one out of several judgments.
Please.
It's obvious that you haven't bothered to research US law. It's obvious that you haven't bothered to look at US Supreme Court judgments. But let me, for your benefit, read one. There are 3 or 4 judgments of US Supreme Court. I'm only reading one. And this is what it says. When a statute conflicts with a treaty, when a statute, Hyde Act, and I'm not assuming any conflict, assume it conflicts. I will show in a moment why the Hyde Act does not conflict. But assume it conflicts. When a statute conflicts with a treaty, the later of the 2 enactments prevails over the earlier under the last in time rule. In Whitney versus Robertson, the Supreme Court of the US said this: by the Constitution, a treaty is placed on the same footing and made of like obligation as an act of legislation. Both are declared by the instrument to be the supreme law of the land, and no superior efficacy is given to the law over the treaty. If the 2 are inconsistent, the later one will prevail. And immediately pause and think, why is the sequencing of the 1, 2, 3 agreement what is now being done? Have you noticed the sequencing? The sequencing is a draft 1, 2, 3, there is then a Hyde Act, and after the Hyde Act, this 1, 2, 3 goes back to the US Congress. The last in point of time to which the US Congress will affirm and give its seal of approval will be the 1, 2, 3, which is why the last in point of time will prevail. This sequencing of the 1, 2, 3 is not accidental. The sequencing is built in, and the sequencing is built in because whenever the US legislature intends the treaty to be the last expression of the sovereign will, they take it back to their Congress. And the last expression of the sovereign will of the US legislature will be and shall be the 1, 2, 3 treaty if and when it is approved by the US legislature, not the Hyde Act. Now come to the 4th point. It is wrong to suppose that the Hyde Act in fact conflicts. The Hyde Act is seen by you to conflict because you read portions like section 101, Mr. Sinha, my friend, read the whole of the joint conference, which is about 50 pages. Then 101, 103, 109. These are provisions which have what they call the sense of the House. They have provisions which have a statement of policy. These are words from the Hyde Act, not my words. There are words there which say that we must follow a policy of global non-proliferation, we should not allow or encourage Iraq or Iran, and that we hope and trust that countries will reduce their nuclear arsenals and so on and so forth. Well, sir, the Hyde Act, even without the 123, has two portions, as does every similar US enactment. Again, unlike our law. And if you don't know that distinction, if you don't care to find that distinction, you are bound to make this mistake. The two parts are the hortatory, the exhortatory, the declaratory, the policy part, and the second part is the prescriptive part. 101, which is called the sense of the House, 103, which is called statement of policy, 109, which talks of all these exhortations about global non-proliferation, and the entirety of the 50 pages.
Which says, don't, if you test, it will terminate.
Absolutely. No, that is valid. That is valid. Yes. I did not say, Mr. Shori, I did not mention 104.
106.
I agree that 104, Mr. Shori, I agree that 104 and 106 are prescriptive. I have not said so. So don't put, I'll deal with, let's do one by one. We are dealing with testing in a moment.
Mr. Shori, you will get
a
a chance to speak.
I'm only
then you
dealing
can reply.
101, 103, 109 and the 50 pages which Mr. Yashwant Sinha read partially on joint conference. A joint conference is worse than our statement of objects and reasons which the Parliament gives for our Indian Act. It is not prescriptive. It is not binding.
Mr.
It is not applicable
Siddiqui,
at all.
please.
And my friend reads it chapter and verse of 50 pages. Well, what is applicable and why is that? The reason is simple. Under the US law, there is a separation of powers and all parts of a statute are not applicable. Only those parts which are said to be binding are applicable. That is what was clarified categorically twice over, even when we did the earlier debate, even as I was speaking in the earlier debate on the 16th of June 2006. It was said by the US ambassador and then by President Bush himself that we have declared that these parts of the Hyde Act are advisory, are non-binding. This is said by President Bush, it is said by the US ambassador, and here we are, we will not believe what the US administration says about its own law. We will not believe what the US Supreme Court says about its own treaties. We will not believe what the US Constitution Article 6 says about its own treaties, but we will believe what we want to believe or want to say about these treaties. Well, that is like Alice in Wonderland. You want to live in your own dream world. Sir, Article 2.1 of the 123 was also read, which talks of each party shall implement this agreement in accordance with the respective applicable treaties, national laws, regulations. First of all, the word uses applicable treaties. And 123 is a treaty. But secondly, this is a clause only dealing with implementation. It is in the nitty-gritty of getting permissions, of getting authorizations under local laws. For example, import taxes, cesses, duties. That is what it means. It has nothing whatsoever to do with what is told to you, that it is a hindrance or a bar to activating the 123. There is also a clause 16.4, which is frequently forgotten in the 123. 16.4 says, this agreement shall be implemented in good faith and in accordance with the principles of international law. This is a separate ground. This agreement is supreme under the US Constitution and the US law. But separately and apart from that, it is also very important under the Vienna Convention, because it shall be implemented in good faith and in accordance with international law, because international treaty. And Articles 26 and 27 of the Vienna Convention, and remember, although USA has not signed it, they have not ratified it, they have signed it, would be bound by the spirit of the Vienna Convention. So it is completely wrong and misleading to read the Hyde Act as if it's a statute which overrides, which comes into the domestic law, which is written into and incorporated into the 123. That is completely misleading. Sir, may I now turn to the other aspect, which was of course partly discussed in the lower house. Why is it that is China any the less concerned about its own sovereignty? Is China any the less concerned about being overwhelmed by US subjectivity? The Indo-US plan versus the China-US 123, if I may call it, is so striking in its departures that it is worth commenting upon. we are so concerned here and so much concerned about being overwhelmed in terms of our sovereignty? Well, just a few examples from a comparison of the 1, 2, 3 which China has happily begged for, happily got, and is happily implementing, at least 10 times more inferior than our 1, 2, 3. And we are looking a gift horse in the mouth. Number 1, under the China agreement, there is a separate uranium agreement required with Australia. Nothing they get from USA as far as uranium is concerned. So all their actual consumable supplies have to come from a third country, with which they have to enter a third, very much more stringent agreement, and which is apart from the US. The US promises them nothing. In India, we get direct supplies and we don't have to go to a third country. We can go to any of the NSG countries also. Number 2, the separation plan in the case of China would have to be worked out jointly, consultatively between China and Australia, because Australia is supplying them uranium. In other words, Australia has a veto in terms of separation of those plants that China wants to dedicate to military uses versus those that China wants to use for civilian uses. And what do? We have absolute sovereignty to decide how many we dedicate to military, how many to civilian. Tomorrow, theoretically, we can dedicate all our future plants to military, and there is no compromise. Nobody inspects, nobody comes, and we say no. This is an assault on our sovereignty. No upfront reprocessing permission granted to China. None. We have, apart from Japan, we are the only country in the world which has an upfront, advance US permission for reprocessing rights, subject to safeguards that we will have a separate national reprocessing facility. In any case, China has no agreement like this. Perpetual safeguards. Well, we have absolutely no possibility of any non-IAEA inspector coming. None. In the China agreement, there are possibilities and potentialities for US inspectors and indeed even Australian inspectors to visit. Nothing like that as far as we are concerned. And why is that? It is because China has decided that it wants to play a major role in the energy demand, which is going to increase in the next 20, 30 years, to sustain its 10%, 11%, 9% rate of growth, to become truly a dragon and an elephant. It is proposed in China, incidentally, that by 2050, they will have 150 reactors with 150,000 MW of energy from nuclear sources alone. Well, I know that we have, and we are proud of that, we have a democracy. And sometimes it's a very acceptable and desirable price of democracy to pay. But then we cannot twiddle our thumbs while China goes and gets 150 reactors with 150,000 MW towards which they are racing. Is it not ironic and interesting that there are only 2 places on earth which are opposing us tooth and nail? There are only 2 spots on earth which oppose us vehemently. One is China, the other is Pakistan. Is there a reason for it? Is there a pattern to it? Well, ironically, the 3rd place in a democracy where we have opposition is ourselves in India. Well, that's the only 3 places there is opposition to this agreement. That's a question which you need to turn over in your minds. Incidentally, the military part of the program is completely and will remain completely untouched. This is a bogey. When Mr. Yashwant Sinha talks of our deterrent, well, there is absolutely no touching on our deterrent. I'll deal with testing in a moment. You can have as many military plants you want. This is really a separation given by USA uniquely to India. And let me end on this point by saying that perhaps today we have 8 out of 22 which we have kept apart from our military. Well, these 8 units or reactors can produce about 200 bombs. And let me assure you that 200 bombs is more than what we need, more than the whole world needs to bomb ourselves, all of us, twice over out of existence. We don't need any more. We already have 8. But remember, in case you want more than 200 bombs out of 8 reactors, you can have 20 more reactors like that, no questions asked, no inspections. But let me come now to an argument which is equally like a red flag as the Hyde Act. Hyde Act I've dealt with. Let me deal with testing now. So we've dealt with energy security, we've dealt with cost, we've dealt with Hyde Act, we've dealt with Indo-China comparison. The 5th point, the testing. Question put bluntly, can we have Pokhran 3 after Pokhran 2? Answer categorically, unequivocally, unambiguously, yes, we can. The question was, can we do it? Yes, of course we can do it. Now, do you want affirmative US permission? Do you want affirmative US support to do your third test? Can you imagine a world where you will go to the USA and say, please support me for doing my third test? Is that conceivable? Your question is, can we do it? The answer is unequivocally yes. But you want to frame the question in a manner where it appears that the US must go out of its way to pat you on the back and support you for doing your third test. Well, that is not going to happen. And let me tell you something very interesting about testing. You are not able to cite, and I challenge you with utmost respect to cite, a single clause, a single word, a single phrase in the 1, 2, 3 which stops you from testing. Answer nil. 2. 1, 2, 3 indeed, curiously, does not use the word test or explosion at all. I may be wrong, but I've checked it. The word test or explosion is not used in the entire 1, 2, 3. I have already demonstrated that the Hyde Act will not override the 1, 2, 3. The 1, 2, 3 is the last expression of the sovereign will. But now assume for a minute that the Hyde Act has anything to do with the subject. The Hyde Act has two parts. One is an exemption from the old US law, the energy law, the atomic energy law. And the Hyde Act exempts you by allowing you to get waivers under the old 1954 law. That exemption remains. The rest of the Hyde Act says, and he's right in 104 and 106, it says that we do not contemplate testing. Now, in the event that you test, it is not that the 1, 2, 3 prohibits it. It is the fact that no country in the world will go out of the way to permit you to test or will affirmatively acknowledge that you can test. That does not mean that you have lost your sovereign right to test. You had the right in 98 when you, Mr. Sinha, or your predecessor made the statement on the United Nations floor. You had the right in 99 when your Prime Minister made the statement of a unilateral moratorium on testing. And let me tell you a good reason why they did so. And that's the same reason why all governments like us also adhere to it. The reason is that this whole testing phobia is overemphasized. Most countries, in fact, do not need to test because we have done all the tests we want. Do you know of the Nuclear Club of Five? Do you know of the Nuclear Club of Five? Britain and France have no testing sites on their own soil at all. They have no testing sites, so they very rarely test. They have not tested for years. Of the balance 3, Russia has the site, but it has signed the CTBT, which means Russia is governed on testing issues by the CTBT. Even of the nuclear club, that leaves only 2, USA and China. Now these 2 have signed the CTBT, but not ratified the CTBT. Both of them. There is a view that if you sign a treaty and don't ratify it, you are still bound by the spirit of that treaty. So in actual fact, the whole issue of testing is overemphasized. We have many bombs, I don't know how many, we have many military reactors, we don't need to test. But in the unlikely event that your scientists say that you can't live without testing, you have the absolute sovereign right to test. What happens if you test? Well, if you test, you may have to go under the procedures prescribed under 2 very significant clauses of the 1, 2, 3, which are being ignored by you. The 2 clauses are clause 5.6 and clause 14, which is the right to return clause. And 5.6, which you gave an argument about, I'm sorry, doesn't bear out your argument at all. 5.6 gives you full protection in every possible way about continuous supplies. And can I just read some parts of 5.6? 5.6 starts by saying the US has conveyed its commitment to the reliable supply of fuel. And then you've read part of it. There are 1 whole page, 7 clauses which reiterates the commitment to supply. The question you raise is that if you test and you terminate under 14, what will happen to this right? Remember 2 things. Under 14, you are not required to stop immediately. There is no interruptus automatically the moment you test. 14 is itself a significant increase. I want to ask you a question. When Mrs. Gandhi tested in 1974 and when you tested in 1998, did they not immediately impose sanctions? Well, now under 14, you have a more liberalized regime. They can't do that for 1 year. Under Article 14, for 1 year, they have to talk to you. So you have a much more liberalized regime than you ever had. on testing for all these decades. Today under the 1, 2, 3, it specifically says that if you test, both the countries will talk. There will be a 1-year notice period and there will be discussions. It is extraordinary that a party which swears by the testing of Pokhran in 1998 today says that we oppose despite clause 14, a 1, 2, 3 agreement which puts a 1-year gap before any action can be taken. You suffered sanctions on day 1 after you tested in 98 and so did Mrs. Gandhi in 74. Secondly and more importantly, the point you miss, the point that 5.6 is specifically not derogated from. 5.6 in fact does not say that 5.6 is subject to 14. Remember, 5.6 is uninterrupted continuous fuel supply. 14 is termination. 5.6 is not subject to 14. 14 does not override 5.6. On the contrary, 14 has a very extraordinary, interesting clause which says even if we terminate, nothing in 5.6 shall be affected, which means that if and while you are terminating, the 5.6 obligation to continue uninterrupted supplies shall not be touched, and that is in 14. In 14.8, it is not the purpose of the provisions of this article, that is Article 14, regarding cessation of cooperation and the right of return to derogate from the rights of the parties under Article 5.6. Did you read this, Mr. Sinha? This is a preservation of 5.6, and 5.6 is what? That you shall ensure uninterrupted supplies. Well, that is what that is the meaning of uninterrupted supply, which this Prime Minister and this government has got for the first time. Both 14 and 5.6 are unique. They are unique. Of course, it is not realized, frequently not realized, that even signatories to the NPT, even those who are signatories to the NPT, can have a test, provided they leave the NPT. This is a normal rule. If you want to do some testing, you cannot have it both ways.
No,
you cannot have the benefits and continue testing.
Please listen to, please. You can reply when your chance comes.
I can understand why some of these facts are uncomfortable and therefore they do not want to listen to it. But facts are sacred, facts don't change.
Please listen.
Now, in this line of facts,
please
come to what I title the of the BJP. The true, sir, is defined as one who ceases to perceive his deception and who changes his stand with sincerity.
Mr. Singhvi,
and I will
how
grant
many more minutes you want?
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Try to
I will grant that sincerity to the BJP, which makes you a true. Why are you a true? That is because you are the ones who started a strategic phase in 3 particular areas: in civilian nuclear, in civilian space, in high-tech trade. You then tangoed for many years with Mr. Strobe Talbot.
No.
Mr. Strobe Talbot.
What is the problem?
Test these bombs and see what America does. You say it will take 1 year for them to put sanctions. But believe me, before that 1 year ends, they will start putting pressure on us on every way.
Mr. Abdullah,
please.
That is something which
No, Mr. Jodi, Dr. Abdullah, please.
We will come to that.
Now, you will get the chance.
Why don't you allow...
Now, please, you address the chair. Please address the chair.
Mr. Chairman,
please address the chair.
Can I answer his point by asking him a counter question? Why does he not first allow the deal to be signed? We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We'll come to it. Now, you having started the strategic arrangement, forget that Mr. Talbot tangoed. I'll try to be very quick because Mr. Talbot tangoed for many months and years with the then foreign minister. It was very interesting for the then foreign minister, whom I've always felt is conspicuous by his absence on any such debate on nuclear energy. It is very interesting that Mr. Jaswant Singh never participates in these debates. Thereby, I think, hangs a tail. It's a very significant omission, but he would have much to say about what was discussed, what was not discussed. Why is it that that deal did not go through? Well, thereafter, the BJP changes tack and forgets its own statement on United Nations floor, and today accuses us of testing issues. After your unilateral moratorium, after your unilateral commitment on the CTBT, how on earth can you ask us questions about testing with this Prime Minister having extracted a 5.6 and a clause 14? Is it not On the one hand, you are prepared to give a moratorium. On the other hand, you are asking us question about testing.
Yes, conclude now.
Lastly, on transparency, my friends on the left know well that the Prime Minister has made statements on this issue many times. Not once, but more than 5 times. On 29th of July, 27th of February, 7th of March, and so on.
Yes, yes.
The reason they give is that this was made before the passage of the Hyde Act. Well, after the passage of the Hyde Act, more than 8 months passed. Of course, we did not say that you will accept it in toto, but we were surprised by the vehemence of your objections when the process has been going on for over 2 years. So just give me a couple of minutes and I'm going to end.
No.
I want to only make this point. There's
one more speaker.
This agreement is the first time that India has advanced reprocessing rights. This agreement is the first time where no fallback safeguards are required. This agreement on all fronts is good. I submit, sir, that this House, that those who oppose it must keep an open mind and try to move away from their stated positions to support what is a good agreement in the interest of India.
Thank you. Mr.